Imagine a world where every threat, ransomware, supply chain attacks, zero-day exploits is stopped before it can even begin. ThreatLocker makes that world a reality with a zero-trust approach to cybersecurity. By giving you granular control on every executable that can happen in your environment, ThreatLocker protects your business around the clock. No more guessing, no more gaps. Just rock-solid protection that keeps your operations running smoothly and your data secure. Discover how ThreatLocker's least privilege approach can safeguard your organization against known and unknown threats. Take the first step towards total peace of mind. Visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker today. Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Jason Albuquerque and Ben Carr. All right, guys, so the hard part. How do we actually do this? Now, Jason, you were hinting in the first segment as we were setting this up that there's probably some tools that organizations already have that could help them down this path.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. It's taking a look at the tool sets that you have available. I mean, the majority of organizations that I work with at least have Microsoft licensing to some degree, right? M365, some Azure licensing. Well, there's some great tools in there. One of them in particular is Microsoft Purview, right? And that's the old Microsoft information protection. And as we know, Microsoft has been investing a ton in their security solutions, a ton, right? So right out of the gate, you may be paying for, let's say, E5 licensing and you have, Azure subscription. Take a look at Microsoft Purview. It's something that you have available to you. And it allows you to do a comprehensive level of data discovery, not just in the cloud, right? It does automatic data scanning. It does data mapping of everything that you have in Azure and Microsoft 365, but it can also crawl your SQL databases. It can crawl AWS S3 buckets. You can have connectors that can connect into third-party tools. It can scan on-prem if you still have on-prem file servers, right? You can still scan all of those different items. They've created it so you can, because they realize that most organizations are in a hybrid scenario, right? It's not just going to all be up in Microsoft Cloud. So develop these so you can get a really good visibility into your data landscape across all of your environments. That way you can bring it all back and start doing the hard work, right? And it gives a ton of data. It goes back, it can even give you like data lineage to show how unstructured data has kind of moved around your network. So you can see all of that. You can search and browse. You can do discoveries on it, right? You can actually get deep into the data. Then once you have that inventory, and it's never going to be 100%, but hey, listen, 80-20 rule and fine tune the sucker, right? I mean, at the end of the day, doing nothing is still, right? It's still something. You're
Right.
doing nothing. That's a choice that you make. Actually do something and get visibility into 80% of your data landscape.
Right? Like that's the big thing is you have to start. Like I've heard this a lot. Like, hey, I could probably get structured data, but unstructured data is super hard. Well, get your structured data. Start somewhere, right? Don't drop the ball.
And I mean, in all honesty, unstructured data with these type of tools is not hard anymore, right?
And start having the conversations. I mean, the first place to start before you're even gathering this is initiate those conversations with the people in your organization who are data custodians and try to understand what the data is, because that will give you a much better insight into what tool or tactic you need to be able to get in front of your data problem.
That's right. But key is the visibility, right? Like I said in the last segment, visibility into that is the start of the conversation. It's not the end. Once you get that visibility and that data mapping, that's the beginning of your journey. From then, it's have the conversations, get with the business, learn about what the data means, learn about what the risk to the organization is, start classifying that data. But, within these tools, you can do those type of things, right? And it's a combination. It's not just like it's Microsoft with automation doing whatever the hell it wants to your data. You make a choice. Do you want them out of the gate to put some automatic classifications on it because it knows it found social security numbers or bank account numbers? Or do you want to just put it in a monitor mode and look at it and make sure, and then do some level of quality assurance against it, right? Kind of like what we used to do on the security scanning side, right? You don't automatically want to orchestrate a fix. You want to put it in monitor mode for a while so you can kind of see the behavior of what's going on in your network. You can do the same thing with tools like Microsoft Purview, where you can get the visibility, have it in a level of monitoring mode, get a sense of what the baseline of what's going on is, and then you can start talking about the orchestration and automation and classifications that you're doing automatically.
And I think this is one. Sorry, Matt, go ahead. You were going to say something.
I was going to say, I think the biggest challenge is scope, right?
Yeah.
Now, this gives you a starting point, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're a Microsoft shop, you've got some capabilities. Look at your Microsoft portfolio, but unless you talk to the business, you don't know where the rest of the data is, right? Understanding that scope outside of maybe what you have access to, because you're going to have data sitting in Salesforce, you're going to have data
100%.
sitting in all Workday, you have data sitting in lots of places. If you're not having conversations with the business, you're not going to know where all those other places are. Then, Jason, what you can do is, I got my 80-20. Now, how do I start to get visibility into that other 20%?
100%.
Because now I have a better understanding of scope.
The way to get the conversation, though, is to walk in the door, let's say to your chief marketing officer, and say, hey, we're out there and we're evaluating our data landscape. Here's everything we were able to find. Start talking about that risk and say, after you have that conversation, what am I missing?
Yeah.
That opens up a whole new world right there, right?
And I'll tell you, you'll often walk into that conversation with the CMO or the CFO and say, here's what we know about the applications. They'll be like, I didn't know we were using that application. That's a good conversation to go back to the CFO, right? Like you can offer value back at that point, even to the CMO, and say, look, how can we help you save some money? Let's consolidate the data. Let's get it out of 6 apps, put it into 2 apps, right? What's that resolution look like to get you a more concise landscape that you're dealing with? And how do you figure that out? Right. I mean, I think understanding that inventory just of applications and then your data flows, what data is going back and forth, being able to have the intelligent conversation with that business leader and say, I know these are your apps. What data is in the apps? And then, I don't know. Okay, well, who can I work through with that? Don't you see that that's a problem if we don't know what data is in there, right? Like those are all the starts of the conversations and how you build those trust relationships.
And that's what's going to get you to the point where you can start having the more mature conversation of, okay, now how do we classify this data and who should have access to it and who should not have access to it?
Right.
Yeah. How do we start doing that label of classification, giving it, that sensitive information type, right? Where you can actually put a labeling on it. So now you know who's going to be able to have access to it, who cannot have access to it, and you're doing it that way. And it's going to be a combination. You're going to leverage some level of automation because you want to be able to do, a broad brush because this is definitely the profile of the data. Boom, get it all done. But there's going to be elbow grease where you're going to have to go back and manually do some level of classification because there's going to be instances of data that maybe Purview sees it as a bank account number, but it's not. It's some type of a number that you use internally, right?
Yeah.
To classify.
And if you think about post-breach, right, Jason, there's a lot of CISOs out there, a lot of security leaders who aren't CISOs, who have never been through a breach before. We all think everybody's been through a breach, but it isn't the case, right? Probably there's a large majority that have it. If you haven't been through it, the first question that gets asked when a breach happened is, what's the data?
Yep, exactly.
And if you can't answer that, like the rest of the breach goes very poorly, right? Like it's a downhill slope after that because you're playing catch up just to try to figure out what's the scope of the breach that I now have to address.
100%.
Yeah.
And do I have a regulatory requirement to
disclose it? Report to? Yeah.
And hey, listen, I mean, at the end of the day, when you're dealing with terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data, and do you really want to have to go back to the attorney and say, I really don't know, so we're going to have to classify everything?
Look, you've got 10 million customer records. Okay, how many customers were affected? I don't know.
Well,
so we've got to send out breach notification to all 10 million?
That's right.
Right? Like this is why it's so important because you have to understand scope to understand, again, back to your context question, Matt, like these are all the things we need to know to make intelligent decisions, right? And to shorten the breach cycle. Look, you've got a very short reporting window, right? Like in India, I think it's a 24-hour reporting window. Like not knowing these things and being faced up against 24, 72-hour, windows is not pleasant. It's a race against time to get this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. When we were doing our tabletop exercises, we actually realized some of the gaps we had in understanding like data, who had access, et cetera, right? Tabletops are another interesting way to correlate some of this because it kind of puts you in that breach mindset to say, oh, wait, who has access to that? Well, like what happened to that data? It forces you to kind of understand that. It's a way to validate some of this. But Jason, Ben, when you think about this inventory and you start classification, right? And you think about all the sources, where does this data get stored? How do you centralize it all in a way that you know where it is? Like, is it Purview? Is it some other system? Like, how do I manage all of this? Because it's not all going to be one source, right?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of it, the benefit that I've seen leveraging Purview is that it's a unified platform. They built it as such where you can have all of these third-party connectors for your third-party applications, third-party tools, right? You can do things like scanning of GCP. You can scan AWS, right? So it has all of these different connectors, and it's all cloud driven for the Azure and the M365 side of the aisle. So all your email, all your Teams, all your SharePoint, right? All of that stuff is in scope there as well. And then all of your on-prem. You can connect on-prem and do the same level of discovery and classification that you can with everything that's in the cloud. So for me, it's a great unified platform that I found that's extremely useful, gives you a ton of information and the tools to be able to classify and protect it at the end of the day.
Now, the only challenge is if you're not Microsoft and you're Google Workspace.
Agreed.
Now what?
Yeah, it's a problem. And no matter how good Purview is, it doesn't solve the entire use case solution.
No.
Right? And that's where I really think we talked about it as an asset. If you really think about it as an asset, it should be your CMDB, right? Somehow, because you also really should have like change control if the classification's changing, if you're moving stuff from one repository to another, if you were taking down the recovery tier, like all these things really require change control, right? Which is why CMDB was initially initiated. But I think we've been let down by the market space because it's really not built to support it. Like, look how long it took them to take on virtualization. And then, applications, right? Like, it's not thought of in that way. And so I think in a lot of cases, people are building things to do this, right? Sure. Or they're taking multiple sources and kind of trying to figure out how to build the connections to get that context. This is the do hard part.
This is what I was going to ask, like, which CMDBs actually can support all this data. Right.
Be able to consider it a data asset. That's the struggle, right? And then I mean, even just talk about like the developer world, right? At the end of it, you have Purview that can do things like structured data, unstructured data, all of your cloud data, but how are you protecting GitHub? GitHub has its own advanced security suite that you need to be working in, right? So it's going to be a combination of tools. But I like Purview for that data landscape piece. That's your, again, 80-20, right? It's your unstructured data. It's your databases. It's your cloud data. It's all of the major line of business applications that have connectors to it. So you're getting that one unified platform that can handle many things for you. And then all of those ancillary use cases, like a GitHub, right? You're using different type of security, but you have to be able to bring it all together at the end of the day. Right?
And because the data is really, like, again, we don't have something that actually travels with the data, and the data is sometimes hard to put into a system. What I see a lot of people starting out with is the data flows. Like, if you can look at the applications and then look at the data flows, so what data is going from app to app. If you have an exposure or breach or some incident, or you have something that you're trying to address the data problem with, then you can at least go back to the data flow and say, I know the data types that are going into, I know the average number of records that they have. And so you can kind of start there as a good starting point while you're trying to figure out that, okay, how do I actually use data as an asset and get it into some asset system where I'm actually tracking it?
Yeah, and I mean, the good
like
thing
tracking 10 million records in an asset management system. I mean, that's not like the scope and scale starts to become a problem just due to the nature of the data, right? So you're looking at like the macro. I have a data asset that is my social security numbers, right? Not number one, number two, number three. Like tracking them all.
It's the classification.
You couldn't do it
right
now, and that's a thing where I think we're going to look at AI to start solving some of this and the agent problem. So as you're creating the data, having an AI agent that's actually looking at that and like imparting information around that, putting it into classification systems. I think this is a very promising field for AI to get into, and as well, quantum. As we start looking at like the speed and the transaction ability of that, I think the emergence of this is going to be a problem that people are going to start to have to address, especially with the regulation.
I think that's where, because right now with unified labeling, you actually can have the security follow the data, right? Yeah. I mean, and we've tested it in thousands of instances, right? Where, somebody accidentally attaches a PDF that may have social security numbers to an email. Well, it gets to its source, but that person can't open it because unified labeling and information protection says, you're not Jason Albuquerque and you're not the CEO of this company. So guess what? You're not opening it. It fails right out of the gate, right? So it's happening now. It's just, you got to do the hard work to get yourself there to be able to do that.
You've got to have the inventory and those classification settings set up right in order to do it. Now, that also requires data ownership, right? And stewardship. Like this is another missing piece. Like it's great, Jason, that Purview can go get all this data. You can start to assign classification, but who owns it? Who gets to make the final say on the classification of that data and who has access to it? Now you got to go back into the business and understand who's the owner of this data.
One of the things I was just going to say is you can treat it like a hatchet job and do unified labeling across the entire system. And guess who's going to drop the business to its knees, right? You don't ever want to be that person. You don't. Yes, you can. The system would allow you to say, let's do unified labeling, treat everything as sensitive information and don't let it go anywhere. But you're going to bring the business to its knees. The business is not going to be able to function. You're not going to be able to communicate. You have to do all this hard work of everything we talked about to get the inventory, to classify, to understand risk, collaborate with the business unit, right? And that's where that data stewardship comes from. Because at the end of it, you want to be able to have a team of folks out there helping you protect the data. You should have resources within the business units who are those data owners, those stewards who you're working with all the time on this journey.
When I started this project at Nokia, again, years ago, one of the things we found, because we did an assessment to figure out, the initial task was like, let's put in DLP. The question is like, is this going to work, right?
Yeah.
How are we going to do this? Like, so we sat back and said, we're not going to implement DLP. What we're going to do is we're going to sit back, we're going to assess the organization, interview a bunch of leaders, figure out like what the real problem is. And one of the things that we came to quickly was the best place to make these decisions is with the originator of the data, right?
100%.
The data owner. They may not be the custodian, but they're the owner of the data. And so once we started that, like you have to put a stake in the sand and say, okay, we're going to start. We found that the owner of the data, the person that created it, you're creating a PowerPoint for a sales presentation. Well, creating that PowerPoint, you have care over that because it's your project. Like you want it to succeed. You want it to go well. So you're more likely to implement the controls, right? Rights management back in the day, right? Labeling, classification, like all that stuff. And so we found that the uptake was much higher in the 80 to 90% when we moved to the owner. And the success rate and the ability to actually honestly address what the data was and not mislabel it was like super high, ridiculously high, right? Versus if you did it 2 or 3 people down the lane when they had it. And so that's, you have to start. You have to put a stake in the sand and then start. Yes, you can go back and do some stuff, but it's going to be a lot more successful on data that's really well structured that you understand. You can do that. But getting your estate in control, I think that's the first thing you got to do is figure out where you're going to start and then go.
And Ben, that's a great point. I mean, the most successful Purview implementations that I've seen happen are the ones where the business gets end users involved, gets them trained, because in Word, in PDFs, in unstructured documents, you can actually assign a label.
Yeah.
Right? So you can decide as a business what labels you want to put on: internal, external, confidential, right? Intellectual property. You can put those labels out there, and then you train your staff on the daily, right? You keep them up with, here's how you label things. Here's the best practice. Here's how you do things. As you create the data, as you start to save it out there, you're labeling it.
Yeah.
So now you have the power all the way down to the end user where they can look at a Word document and say, oh crap, this has social security numbers. Boom, sensitive, confidential, whatever you want your label to be. Now right out of the gate from creation, it's labeled.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I know in Google Workspace, when I create a new document there, based on what I put in it, it auto kind of classifies it for us, right?
And you can do that, right? You can do that with Purview. You can say, the second you find something that's sensitive in a document as it's being created, auto classify it.
Right.
right?
And then you can enforce.
So if you train your workforce, though, right? Like that's a great tool, I think, right? But like if you force that, you'll have a lot of error. So what you can do is you can have it do that, but allow the user to correct it and say,
absolutely.
Yeah, look,
absolutely.
Like, so I always used to, we were trying to do unstructured data, and it was like we'd have a project, and the project would be codenamed Chicago. So anything with Chicago in it would get stamped with that project code name. But then somebody would say, hey, I'm taking a trip to Chicago, and the email would get stamped to Chicago. And it'd be like, it has nothing to do with the project, which would cause a lot of problems downstream. So giving the user the ability to go back and say, nope, good try, but this is actually what it's related to.
Right.
That's where you build, and you actually build, I think it's not just the accuracy, but you actually build this trust base with your users to say, we're not forcing you to do stuff and it's all computers and it's like you have the ownership. If you don't do it right, you're responsible for it. And so that ownership then, I guess it builds a connection to the user base that I think pays off a lot of dividends.
100% agreed.
Well, it's kind of a shared responsibility model. It's not sitting all on the CISO's plate to do this. It's everybody's responsibility now, right? And so you're not putting the burden on the security team to go try to retrofit and find all this stuff. You're putting it in the hands of the users, give them some of the responsibility. Now you have a shared responsibility model. And if your data gets breached, like, you're the owner, you classified it wrong.
And we had incidents. So one of the things we were trying to prevent was images of phones going out, right? And that we found that the most interesting data point was that people weren't sharing the phones because they wanted like personal, cred or anything. They thought it would help out the company because it would be like, oh, this new phone's coming out. Promotion. It actually was negative to the company. So when we started sharing that, we actually found that they took it in, but we saw instances where people would report back they were in a meeting with like a third party and the person would say, I can't share this because it's watermarked with my info. So if you put a request in, I'll put it through the process and we'll be able to send it to you, but it'll be tracked to you as well. And your information will be watermarked. And so like you're building this whole culture, like this shared responsibility model, you're changing the culture of the company. And once you start to do that, man, it takes off like a rocket. Like everybody starts to get on board. 99% of your users aren't trying to mess with you or screw your program. They want to do the right thing. But if you're not teaching them or giving the tools, it's not going to be successful.
Yeah. There's no better tools available to a CISO than have a force multiplier like that. Train the end users to have the responsibility and ownership of that data and do the right thing. Because they will. Like you said, 99% of the time, they're going to do the right thing.
Yeah. And I think this becomes important when we think about where we're going with artificial intelligence, right? Because this is a whole curveball of now you have data that you want to put into these AI models, and where are they allowed to go and not allowed to go? Because one, you don't want to expose sensitive data into some of these models, right? You don't want to send confidential data to DeepSeek right now. You just don't, right? Because it's all probably never, because it's all stored in secure servers in China, by the way. It's right in their terms and conditions. But there are going to be models you're hosting yourself where that data can go, right? And it's going to produce data as an output that, it's going to create unique data. And how do I use the initial classifications that went in to automatically calculate the results coming out? Because otherwise, this problem of sprawl only gets worse, doesn't it?
Yeah, 100%.
And the velocity of it, the amount of data that's going to be generated, right? The speed with which, because it's these agents that are going to be operating on the data and then generating that unique data.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally why we as an organization, anytime a customer comes to us and says, hey, we really want to dig deeper into this Copilot thing, the first question we ask is, have you done a data inventory? Have you classified your data? And do you have unified labeling enabled? And the answer is 90% of the time, no. So we won't do an AI Copilot engagement until we help you secure your data landscape. Like we're going to have the purview conversation. We're going to have the data classification conversation, because the foundation of everything is security. Before you modernize, before you innovate, before you bring any of these other tools out there, the first thing you have to do is secure. Then you can modernize, right? Then you can go do these innovative things. Right. But security has to be the baseline, has to be the foundation of it all. So our conversations about Copilot and AI are, have you secured your data landscape? Then we can talk about that.
And that's a good point, Jason. Like anytime, where do you start, right? Okay, it's going to be a long road. Well, the first thing you should start is like getting somebody from security in on the ground floor of any new project you're doing. Understand 100%. The data requirements, the data flows, have conversations about data privacy. Like all those things are foundational to build the house. Like if you don't do that, you're only compounding the problem you're going to have to deal with later.
And that should be the foundational component in your security policy from day one.
Should.
Right, Jason? Right?
It has to be.
We can't do anything with artificial intelligence until we do inventory classification and 100%. Turn on, the sensitivity.
It's controls. Always been important, but it's now more important than ever. Ben's term velocity is dead on. The velocity at which things are happening today are exponentially faster than they were 5 years ago. Exponentially. Yep. And it's only going to go faster.
Yeah. Moore's law squared.
That's it. It is. So you have to do these core things first before you go jump into this AI world. And you literally put all your sensitive data out in front of, best case scenario, all of your employees. Worst case scenario, the world.
Right. Right. And I think that's what people have to understand. Like this new space of AI is interesting, and it can create a ton of advantage for organizations. It can create a lot of growth for companies. But if you don't protect the core data going into these models and the data coming back out, it could actually have repercussions that could allow you to go out of business in some respects. Right?
100%. I mean, the reward is exponential, but the risk is exponential as well.
Yeah.
It is, right? I mean, at the end of it, it's a great tool that could send your business to the moon, but it could also cripple your business tomorrow because you're losing intellectual property, you're losing sensitive information, you're setting yourself up for privacy issues or a breach.
It's funny, we focused this segment on data inventory and classification, but we did get back to one of our root principles, is that this is a risk management problem, folks.
Yes, it really is. Isn't it all?
Isn't it all?
What's the mantra, Matt? The mantra is either learn how to manage business risk or you're going to report to somebody who does.
Exactly right. That might be your CFO, it might be a chief risk officer, but if you embrace the risk management side of this,
it'll be
you're the one in control.
That's right.
Yes. Gentlemen, always a pleasure. Great segment, by the way. You guys know your stuff. Thank you everyone for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.